Okay, so let me share my slides. There we go. Hopefully you can all see that. So I think I should just mention up front that I have been involved in educational technologies, the use of educational technology, since the late 1980s when I was doing my PhD in the US. And so I tend to see every new technology, excuse me, as a tool rather than something that we should focus on for its own sake. Excuse me. Okay, so I want to just begin by standing back a bit and looking at the world that we are living in at the moment. So we know that there is a horrendous amount of pollution due to plastic. It's clogging the oceans, it's damaging the planet, it's getting into our bodies. Climate change, we've seen terrible, terrible fires, floods, and this extraordinary division between rich and poor, where the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, the middle class is shrinking, more and more people are living in a state of deprivation. And then loss of biodiversity, loss of habitat, orangutans, polar bears, some of the large marine mammals, as well as many smaller species. So the world is in a mess. And then we have this terrible phenomenon of fake news and rejection of reason. And this is an interesting quote from David Bohm from 1996. And he says, in spite of this worldwide system of linkages, and this was really when the World Wide Web was becoming more commonplace, there is at this very moment a general feeling that communication is breaking down everywhere on an unparalleled scale. What appears in the media is generally at best a collection of trivial and almost unrelated fragments, while at worst it can often be a really harmful source of confusion and misinformation. And I think that his observations have become more and more true as time has gone on. And then anti-science. Anti-science has emerged as a dominant and highly lethal force, and one that threatens global security as much as do terrorism and nuclear proliferation. Anti-science is the rejection of mainstream scientific views and methods, or the replacement with unproven or deliberately misleading theories, often for nefarious and political gains. It targets prominent scientists in attempts to discredit this. And we've seen plenty of this. We saw this during COVID, and I don't know how many people lost their lives because of anti-science views that were being promulgated. And of course, we're seeing it with climate change as well. And then if we look at our current crop of students, most of them are Generation Z, or some people say Generation Z, students who were born between 1997 and 2012. And this generation is different from the ones before them, from the millennials and the ones before that. This generation's identity has been shaped by the digital age, climate anxiety, a shifting financial landscape, and of course, COVID-19. Digital natives often turn to the internet when looking for any kind of information. They flit between sites, apps, and social media feeds, each one forming a different part of their online ecosystem. And it might be worth saying at this point that although they're digital natives in the sense that they have grown up with digital technology, often they are not computer literate. I mean, we've seen students who, when they're told to point the mouse, they literally pick the mouse up and point it. They don't have keyboarding skills, but more importantly, they often lack digital literacy in the sense of being able to identify trustworthy sources of information on the internet. And then there was a survey done by McKinsey that reported that in the US, these Generation Zers had the least positive outlook and the highest prevalence of mental illness of any generation. This pessimism is fueled by growing global unrest, wars and disruptions, financial crises, and educational interruptions due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Feelings of climate anxiety are also widely reported. They're already seeing decreased economic opportunity. And I would add to this that a lot of the students that we are seeing now are suffering from isolation. I was at an event on campus earlier this year, and we were bringing together people who had won awards for their blogs in the Climate Change and Me course. And we had a nice lunch for them, and we had a little ceremony. And so the students came, they received their certificates, they had a bite, and instead of staying and socializing and chatting to each other, they dispersed. And I'm hearing more and more from students that they just don't know how to interact in person with other people. And so the sense of social isolation is quite extreme. And then we have artificial intelligence, for good or ill. So we've had predictive text around for a long time. Predictive analytics, Netflix, which drives me crazy. You watch one movie about a child who has a single parent, and the next 100 movies that get suggested for you are about a child with a single parent. And then, as we know, we have large language models and ChatGPT, which became freely available last year in November, and image generation. But there are some, as David Baum says, nefarious uses of various technologies like deep fakes, which can be extremely dangerous for world peace. Profiling that may entrench stereotypes and exacerbate inequity. So if you've never seen the movie Coded Bias, I would really recommend it. Spreading misinformation, we know, through social media, through algorithms based on popularity or trolls. And then there was this really scary article that was in Time last year about how OpenAI employed a whole lot of workers in Kenya to go through the material that they were training ChatGPT on, and the horrible stuff that these Kenyan workers had to look at, and how devastating it was for them. So that's where we are at the moment. And now I want to look at the assessment question. So before we had readily available generative AI, we might have engaged in assessment practices that were less than optimal. It was tempting to possibly recycle assessments, to focus on assessing lower order cognitive skills, to give too few assessments. Sometimes there might have only been 2 assessments during a whole term, whole semester. To give assessments that didn't track students' progress over time. So write an essay, and the assessment was the essay and not any of the component skills along the way or the progress of students along the way. To limit opportunities or requirements for multiple forms of expression and demonstrations of learning. A lot of our assessments were written, and sometimes they were written under timed conditions. And it was tempting to give assessments that are decontextualized or written for another context, particularly the global north. So these are some of the assessment practices that we know were around, that were not necessarily exemplary. And then also to have little interaction with students individually. And we know this is time consuming, but it is important. So as Professor Osman said yesterday, we need to go back to basics. What do we really want our students to know and to be able to do? And then how do we promote the learning of these through our course design, including assessment? And I've been harping on about this at WITS for some time. Assessment is not something you decide how you're going to do after you've designed the course. Assessment needs to be an integral part of your course design. And then how do we ascertain what students have actually achieved? And what about other attributes? So when I was at the CHU running the Quality Enhancement Project, I formulated this view of student success. Attributes that are personally, professionally, and socially valuable. How do we cultivate them? How do we assess them? For example, one of the WITS attributes is awareness of the imperative for development to be environmentally sustainable. So not just what do they know and what can they do, but what about attributes? So I want to take a moment and think about time-saving inventions in the last century or so. The washing machine and the vacuum cleaner, these saved, particularly women initially, probably thousands of hours of labor. The telephone, we didn't have to rely only on telegrams or letters to communicate with people. The calculator, when I was at school, we still used trig tables, and my father used slide rule, and then WhatsApp. So can we think about generative AI, among other things, as a time saver? So various people have given examples of how generative AI might save ourselves and also our students time on low-level or labor-intensive tasks, like generating multiple choice questions quickly for formative assessments. And we could gamify this to make students more keen to actually do them. Searching for information, which we know has to be critiqued, of course, and generating ideas and outlines for tasks. But if we think of it in that way, then what it could do is to free time for more important things, because we know that both lecturers and students are constantly saying, we don't have enough time, we don't have enough time, we're pressured. And we hear that often students resort to practices that are not demonstrating good academic integrity because they're rushed for time. So if we were to use generative AI to free up time for some of the more the lower level things, let's say, the more labor intensive, then maybe we could use AI generated information for students to actually work collaboratively. And we know that if 5 students were to enter a query into, say, ChatGPT, they would come up with 5. If we were to use that as a basis for collaborative tasks with students, then they could work together, strengthen their interpersonal connections, feel less isolated, create a greater sense of belonging, improve their communication skills, and also the critical thinking skills, because if they're getting 5 different answers, then they can discuss with one another. What do we think about these answers? Are they valid? Are they true? What other information sources might we get? It might also help them develop their own voice, and through that to strengthen their sense of identity and self-efficacy. So we know that there's a concern that whole assignments, could be generated by AI and AI tools. But then if that happens, the student loses their voice altogether. And if you have no voice, then where is your identity? So if we were to use the AI as a tool, but then have our assessments designed in such a way that we encourage the student's voice and their own sense of identity, we will help them to be whole and happy people. And lecturers can allow for more input from students and give more feedback, including helping students develop individual voice. More tasks, smaller tasks, not only in writing. We know that through our UWASI, our implementation of Canvas, we can have students submit other forms of media. It doesn't only have to be written text, but then we can design our assessments in a way that we give credit for students developing their voice. We could also give more interesting and more demanding assessments. So I was thinking, for example, that attribute of helping students to understand that technology needs to be sustainable. We could have them, for example, look at, say, 3 or 4 bridges in the developing world and critique them, not just in terms of structural design, but also in terms of the durability, the cost, and the environmental impact of the materials and the design. So maybe we can be thinking about generative AI as a tool to help students experience learning as interesting, worthwhile, broadening their horizons and removing unnecessary drudgery, cultivating a sense of connection and belonging with other students, sharpen students' critical thinking abilities, and also save ourselves time on low-level or labor-intensive tasks like generating MCQs. And then we would have a better chance of being able to focus on the essential skills for the future. So these 4 so-called the 4 C's of 21st century skills, but then others, lifelong learning, global consciousness, entrepreneurship, interdisciplinarity, and various literacies, including critical AI literacy, which I'm guessing Maha is going to speak about just now. So let's be intentional about what we offer students to prepare them for the future, their own future and the world's future, about what we expect of our students and how we're going to support them, about time. How much time is needed for us and for our students to really think, to engage, to do meaningful work, not just to rush through the tasks in order to be done and put a mark on paper. About how we encourage a sense of connection, a sense of belonging, self-efficacy, and purpose. And so, as Professor Osman said, our motto now for WITS is WITS for good. Thank you.
We'll go to Laura Dyson and Shira Mark.
Yeah, I thought that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I just wondered how it seemed to be an optimistic take, Diane, about what we can do, and if we're only intentional, all will be well. So, would you like to comment on that?
It may not be well, but it'll be better. Yeah, I mean, I think we mustn't get bogged down. You know, I mean, my personality is like the cosmos. You know, I try to be optimistic, but you know, I mean, we cannot allow ourselves to be dragged down. And you know, I think someone was saying yesterday, we cannot imagine that these tools will go away. They will not. I mean, I still remember when I was a student last century, people lamenting calculators. You know, students won't be able to do long division anymore. Well, sorry.
Thank you for that comment and also for your response, Prof. I'm going to go to Laura Dyson and then Shira Mark after that.
Thanks, Diane. I agree. Very insightful comments. And I want to ask, there was a very interesting comment made by the main keynote, one of the keynote speakers yesterday, the first keynote speaker, about high value activities, and that perhaps we should move away from differentiating between low value and high value activities. And I want to ask you about that and how we can maybe shift the culture for students to value all activities in relation to your points about learning and learning possibilities, rather than the emphasis on assessment of learning. How do we work with activities so that they, you know, you often talk about cumulative assessment, and I'm not sure that some of the lower order activities, which are meant to build up to the high value activities, are valued as much. And how do we find that balance and also reduce, as was suggested yesterday, the amount of assessments that are provided? Thanks.
So that's many questions in one, Laura. So I feel like there's something fundamentally wrong with what is happening at the moment in the focus of our students, and focus that we are exacerbating, not necessarily intentionally, where it is on achieving a mark, getting a piece of paper. And I think that this generation of students particularly does not have a sufficient locus of control on themselves, on their growth as individuals and as members of communities and society. And it's all kind of externalized. What do they want me to do? Not what do I want to do? How can I grow? How can I develop? And so I think, you know, part of it is engaging with students around that. So I remember years ago listening to a physics education colleague talking about the value of what he called meta-communicating with students. We are doing this activity because this is what we are hoping you will learn and how you will benefit. So that's from the lecturer side. From the student side, then encouraging, and it can be through structured activities. How will I benefit? In what way? What am I learning? In what ways am I growing? What are my challenges through the activity? So adding that extra layer